Hello everyone. In this session, we'll continue adding more functionality to the full stack application that we are building. In the previous session, we had added a password field to the user's entity, and we were able to encrypt that password field as well. And then we took the primary ID, which was an integer, and we changed it into an UUID that is auto-generated. So in this session, we'll learn how to debug custom handlers. In order to do that, we'll take a simple use case where we allow users to be read only if the password is supplied in a custom header. So let me show what I mean by that. So I go in here, and right now when I do a send request for the users or a get request for the users, I get all the users with password and without password. And what I want to do is, if I have a user like this, let me do another get here, and I put in the ID of that user, and I'll get a user with who has a password. So I put in the ID of this user, and when I do a get, and I also want to supply a custom header, and this custom header, let's say I say ABCD, but this is not the right password, but only if I send the right password, when I do this send request, it should give me this data. So right now this password is incorrect, but what we want to do is we want to check if this password matches this encrypted password, and only then get this data. So to do this, we need to do a couple of things. So let me stop running this server here. And to do this, what I need to do is I need to get access to the ID that I'm supplying. So right now I'm supplying this ID right here. So I need some way of getting access to this ID. I also need some way of getting access to this custom header that I'm passing. And then find out if there is a user that matches this ID that was passed in, and if there is a password, and then the way the password is stored, it is one way, so you can only encrypt it. You cannot decrypt it back. So the way we check if this password matches is we encrypt the given password as well, and then we compare it with the stored encrypted password. And if it matches, if it doesn't match, then we throw an exception. Otherwise, we do the read. So let's start with these two things. How do I get access to this ID, and how do I get access to this custom header, this ID and this custom header? So at this moment, I don't know how to do it. So we are going to debug. All I know is this is going to be part of the request object. So let's have a look at the request object itself. So I go into my service object, my JS file. This is where I have my custom handler, and I'm going to do a quick before handler. I will change this later to an on handler, but let's start with the before for now. So I'm interested in doing the custom handler for the read, and I'm also interested in the user's entity. And let's also say I have the request object for this last parameter, which is a function, and I'm going to say console.log. This is a test. Okay, so I have a before function, and what I'm going to do is let me remove this breakpoint here, and I will click on this icon, this debug icon, and I will run it as a debug, and you should see that it says the debugger is attached. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint here. So I want this to hit this breakpoint when I run this request.http. So the breakpoint is set. Make sure it is red in color. And now we go into the request.http, and I send in a request, and it should hit this breakpoint. And now we have a chance to check this request object, all the fields that it contains. So if I go into my local variables, I should see the request object right here. So I open the request object just to investigate all the properties that it has. And like I said, I'm interested in finding this ID that I'm supplying and also the custom header value. So let's look at the request object itself. And here I have, if I go down, I see that there is this data field, and it says my ID, and then it has the ID field value right here. And I can make sure it is the right one. So if I type in request.data.id, and this gives me D55 whatever it is, and if I look in here, and that's the value that I'm passing. So I know how to get access to this ID. Now how do I get access to this custom header? What value is it? So if I go into this request object, at the very top there is a property with an underscore. So typically in JavaScript, when there is a property with an underscore, it is a private variable, but it is in the public realm, public API, so you can use it. So if I open this underscore object, I see different properties right here, and another property here is the request object. So it is request underscore and then a request object again, and I open this up right here, and there is my headers, and if I go into my headers, I see custom header ABCD. So let me double check that right here, request, and then there is an underscore dot request, and then there is this headers, and this looks like and I can search for custom header, and let's see what this value comes up, and it should be ABCD. Yes. So we know how to get access to this request.id and also this custom header. So let's start using it. So in our JS file, in our custom handler, I no longer have to have this console.log as test. I can stop this, and I know how to get access to this ID and this custom header. So let me say let ID equals request.data.id, and this will give me the ID, and let me just console log just to make sure I am getting the ID correctly. So ID colon and then slash ID comma ID. So this is my ID, and then what I want to do is I'm going to do the read anyways because I need to find out if it has a password or not. So I don't want to do this before. So what I'm going to do this is I'm going to do it on, and on actually gives me two parameters, the request object and the next. So if you are familiar with Express, you know this next is how the middleware functions happen. So what I want to do is I want the read to happen, and then when the read happens, I want to find out the password for that read. So I don't want to do it before, because before I'm not going to find out whether the user has a password or not. But I want to do this on, and then I want to use this next so that it actually does the read. So the way I can force this function to run right after the read happens is I can do const users equals await and then next. So what it's basically doing is, and since I'm using await, I have to use async here. So let me kind of briefly explain what I'm trying to do here. This function srv.on starts just before the read happens, and by calling this next, the read actually happens. The generic handler functions. So this generic handler does the read on the user's entity, and we're doing an await, so this function completely happens, and we get all the results in users. So users now has the read results, and what I want to do is if let's say let's also get the custom handler now. So let custom header equals, we know how to get to it. We have this right here, request dot underscore dot request dot headers, and then we have custom header. So we get hold of this custom header value, and let's log this also just for good measure. So the custom header is, we'll log this. Custom header is logged. Now what I want to do is I want to see if this users, if there is a length to it. So let's say if users dot length, Now, typically when we do a read like this, we're only going to get one row. So if the users dot length is not equal to 1, then what we'll do is we'll throw an exception saying return. So with this request object, you can also return right away. So nothing gets processed after this. So we can do a return here and we can reject that request and we can say something like um, 401 no users with a given ID. So if the ID is incorrect, then we immediately throw an exception saying that no users with a given ID. Straightforward. So what we can do is we can quickly test if this is working. So I can do a CDS watch here, and let me also do a save. Let me save everything. Make sure we're on track. So we're reading both the ID and the custom header, and we're also doing this constant const users next. So we get the users, and if this length is not equal to 1, we say no users with this given ID. So we know that this one has a ID, has a user, so I'm going to change the last character to 0. Hopefully that there are no users with that, and I should get a message saying no users with this given ID. Okay, so we are on track. So now what I want to check is the password itself. So right now this means the user's length is 1, so users has a length of 1. So I want to take this user and I want to take this password. So there may be some users without a password, so we want to make sure that there is a password for this user. And if there is a password for this user, then I want to do this check. And how do I check the password? So I have the password value here, but this is in unencrypted form. So I need to compare this with the encrypted password. And the way we can do it is there is a method from bcrypt. So that is called compare, and I can do a await, and this is a asynchronous call as well. Bcrypt.compare, and if you look at the thing, it takes the string and then the hashed password. So the string here is going to be my password, which is in my custom header, and then I can compare it with the password, which is nothing but this. So I can compare it with this password right here. And if this is true, that means the user entered the right password. So if it is not true, that means the user entered an incorrect password. So if it is not true, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return, and I'm going to say request.reject, and I'm going to give a 403 error message, and I'll say passwords do not match. Okay, so far so good. So I give passwords do not match. Let's make sure that this is working. Let me save this guy, and I go in here. I will put this back to 1, and now the password do not match because I know the password I entered was 123456. So let me send a request, and it should tell me that passwords do not match, which is correct. Now let me put in the right password and see what happens. So I need to return this user if that is the case. So in this case, if all goes well, I will return users 0. So this is the user that needs to get returned. Let me save this whole thing and let me run it. And I have the right password here, and I should get the value. Okay, so this is good. And this kind of showed you how you can do the debugging fairly straightforward. You put in a breakpoint here, and you do and then you do the get request or whatever the request that needs to trigger the breakpoint, and then you can check the values here. So this is all about debugging. Now Um, I have the GitHub with the entire source code, so you can check it out. For example, when I do this send request, it's probably not going to work, but I have in the GitHub everything is like I have the entire source code that handles all this. So check it out. See you in the next session.